Welcome to the deep dive where we take a whole stack of really interesting material
Yeah.
and try to boil it down to the absolute key insights. In this case, it's Daniel C. Dennett's book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back. And I mean, we're talking about nothing less than the evolution of minds.
Wow.
Literally from the first, kind of stirrings of life to the incredible complexity of human consciousness.
That's the scope. I mean, he pulls in biology, computer science, philosophy, even linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone like you who, wants to understand these big ideas without wading through, a library's worth of books, we're
Exactly.
highlighting the most
Right,
surprising,
it's the nuggets.
yeah, the nuggets, like
Yeah.
the thought-provoking
The
stuff.
things you tell your friends at a party.
Yeah, and our goal is to make it, not just digestible, but like really interesting, really engaging.
Right. Dennett himself navigates, an incredible amount of information. So we're kind of following in his footsteps, so to speak, in this
Yeah.
deep dive. And our mission really is to figure out, well, some of the most, I think, fascinating and even counterintuitive ideas about how minds have evolved.
Right.
So you ready to see what we can uncover?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that jumps out at you when you take this kind of grand view of evolution
Yeah.
is the crucial, like absolutely crucial role that's played by events that are, statistically speaking,
Yeah.
almost impossible.
So rare events. It seems almost like a contradiction in terms when we're talking about, something as seemingly constant as evolution. How can the infrequent be so fundamental?
So Dennett, he makes this point that these major evolutionary leaps often hinge on these incredibly uncommon occurrences.
Like what?
Well, for instance, good mutations.
Mm.
Most of the time when genes change, it's either neutral or even harmful.
Mm-hmm.
But a mutation that actually helps an organism,
Right.
something that makes it better suited to its environment,
Yeah.
that's incredibly rare. But it's also essential for evolution to keep going, to progress. So they don't happen very often.
Yeah.
But when they do,
Huge impact.
right, it's like nature is rolling the dice billions and billions of times,
Yeah.
and every once in a while, it hits the jackpot.
Right.
It's a mutation that changes everything.
Yeah. So it's like nature playing the lottery and against all odds, winning big and changing the whole game.
Exactly. And it's not just about changes within a species, right?
Right.
It's about the emergence of entirely new species.
CCA.
Speciation, right?
Right.
Which happens when populations get separated somehow
Mm-hmm.
and their genes start to drift apart. Now, this process, it happens less than once in a million births.
Wow. That is rare.
Less than 1 in a million. Think about that. And yet, this incredibly uncommon splitting and diversifying
Yeah.
is what has produced the incredible variety of life we see.
Right.
Millions upon millions of species,
Mhm.
each one springing from this incredibly improbable separation. So, what this tells us is that the amazing richness of life as we know it, it's built on a foundation of these exceptional, these almost unbelievable genetic lottery wins.
Wow. Less than 1 in a million births leading to a whole new branch on the tree of life. That really changes how you see the scale of evolutionary time.
It does. And since we're talking about these unbelievably rare and impactful events, we have to talk about endosymbiosis.
Okay, so this is where things get even more wild. Endosymbiosis, for folks who are just joining us,
Yeah?
this is a story of how one ancient single-celled organism basically swallowed another,
Engulfed. Yeah.
engulfed, and they decided to live happily ever after.
It was a truly bizarre merger. A bacterium, one type of single-celled organism, was taken in by an archaeon.
An archaeon.
Yeah, which is another type of single-celled organism.
Okay.
But instead of being digested, this bacterium, it just stayed put.
It moved in.
It moved in.
Yeah.
And they started living together permanently.
Hence the name endo, meaning within symbiosis, meaning living together.
Exactly. And this unlikely partnership gave rise to the eukaryotic cell.
Okay, so why should our listener sitting here, in 2025, care about this ancient microbial meet cute?
Well, the eukaryotic cell was a game changer. It was so much more complex than the prokaryotic cells that came before.
Like bacteria.
Like bacteria, right?
Sure.
It had more sophisticated internal machinery,
Yeah.
which meant a whole new level of cellular organization and function was possible.
Yeah.
And here's the mind-blowing part. Every multicellular organism you can see, I mean, us, humans, sharks, birds, trees, mushrooms, insects, worms, you name it,
Yeah.
we are all descended from that original eukaryotic cell.
No way.
All because of that one improbable fusion event billions of years ago. So what you take away from this is the deep interconnectedness of all complex life,
Right.
and how this one, freak occurrence at the dawn of evolution, set the stage for everything that followed.
Okay, hold on. So just to be sure I'm following, you're saying that me, sitting here, a human being,
Yeah,
I share a common ancestor with a mushroom,
that's right.
and that ancestor exists because one little microbe decided to move in with another. That's wild.
It really is. It underscores just how deeply intertwined all life on Earth is
Yeah.
and the ripple effects of those really rare, really early evolutionary events.
Okay.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few billion years to what Dennett calls the McCready explosion.
The McCready explosion. Okay, that sounds, well, explosive.
It does.
Really?
It's this period of really rapid biological change that Dennett argues isn't just in the past.
Huh.
It's happening right now.
Okay.
And it's driven by three interconnected factors: population, technology, and intelligence.
Okay, so we've got this huge increase in the human population,
Right.
the constant advancement of technology, and of course our intelligence. But Dennett is suggesting that the cause and effect here is maybe a bit more complicated.
Exactly. You might think, oh, intelligence led to technology. Technology led to this population boom.
Right. Seems logical.
It does. But Dennett, he argues that evolution is often this co-evolutionary dance. Our intelligence, it's not this separate thing. It's intertwined with both our technology
Okay.
and the sheer number of other minds around us.
Right.
The more people you have,
Yeah.
the more chances there are for ideas to collide, to mix, to evolve.
Right, right.
And then you add technology into the mix, from agriculture to the internet.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes how we think, how we learn,
Yeah.
how we interact.
It's true.
So the takeaway here is to recognize this dynamic interplay between population, technology, and intelligence.
Right. So it's this kind of feedback loop, each element amplifying the others
Exactly.
and leading to this rapid acceleration of change.
Right, and Dennett points out this pretty big consequence of this explosion, especially our role in it.
Yeah, he makes a point that because of this explosion, humanity now has a unique power,
Oh, yeah.
a sort of terrifying power. We have the ability to either protect the planet and everything on it, or, well, to destroy it all.
It's true.
No other species
Well,
has ever had this kind of power.
It's a lot of responsibility.
A very sobering thought. Which I think brings us to another topic that often generates a lot of debate:
Okay.
human exceptionalism.
Yeah, this idea that humans are somehow totally unique and superior to all other animals.
Right.
It's definitely a hot topic. So Dennett, he talks about the romantic view.
Romantics.
The romantics, right, who
Mhm.
really emphasize the intelligence and abilities of animals, how they're each incredible in their own ways.
Like chimpanzees and their social structures, or the crazy navigation skills of migrating birds.
Exactly. But then you have what Dennett calls the killjoy perspective.
The killjoys.
These guys, they focus on what humans have done that no other animal has: art, science, technology, even something like controlling fire.
Right, right.
They say, look, no other animal has come close to this level of achievement.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that.
And Dennett tells this great story about a researcher who actually argued both sides of the animal intelligence debate in the same day.
No way, really?
Really. It's a perfect illustration of just how complex this issue is.
Yeah.
Dennett's point is that we shouldn't underestimate animal minds, but we shouldn't overestimate them either.
Yeah.
What's important is to understand the specific abilities that have evolved in different species, including our own.
Right. Okay, so speaking of the human mind, we need to talk about Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis, which, well, it kind of throws a wrench into some pretty fundamental beliefs about who we are.
So this hypothesis, it basically says that everything that makes your joys, your sorrows, memories, ambitions,
Everything.
everything, it's all just the behavior of a huge collection of nerve cells and their associated molecules.
So in essence, a purely physical explanation for, well, consciousness itself.
Yeah. And as you might imagine, this idea doesn't sit well with a lot of people.
Right. It's
Yeah.
kind of a hard pill to swallow for some. Why do you think that is?
Well, for one, it seems to challenge the idea of free will, right?
Right.
If our thoughts and actions are all just the result of these electrochemical reactions in our brains,
Yeah.
then how can we truly be in control?
Right. It raises those questions about responsibility, too.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
If our values, our beliefs are just products of biology, then, well, do they really mean anything?
Yeah, it gets very existential very quickly.
It does. And that's why people have such a hard time with this idea. It gets at the core of our sense of self, you know?
Yeah. It touches on something very personal, our subjective experience of being conscious. Then it mentions that when we think about consciousness, everyone considers themselves the expert. We feel like we have some privileged insight into what it means to be conscious.
Exactly. People will accept scientific explanations for, like, how a heart beats or how the weather works. But when it comes to consciousness, it's like, nope, I know better.
Yeah, like I know what it's like to be me.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Our internal experiences feel so real, so immediate,
Yeah.
that it's really hard to accept that they're just the product of physical processes in our brains.
And Dennett says that this resistance is partly due to what he calls Cartesian gravity.
Right. It's like this invisible force that pulls us back towards this more intuitive, often dualistic view of the mind.
Okay, dualistic, meaning?
Meaning that we see the mind as something separate from the physical body.
Ah.
It's hard to wrap our heads around the idea that purely mechanical processes could give rise to our subjective experience.
Okay, so Cartesian gravity is like this bias in our thinking that makes it hard to think about the mind in purely physical terms.
Exactly. And being aware of this bias, that's the first step to understanding the mind more clearly.
Okay, so we need to recognize those intuitive pulls away from purely physical explanations if we want to really understand the mind. Now, let's talk about genius. Dennett points out that historically we haven't seen a lot of female figures recognized as, like, superstar geniuses.
Right. But he's quick to point out that this shouldn't be taken as some kind of, like, biological proof that women are less capable of genius.
Okay, so what is his explanation?
He argues that genes, while they definitely play a role in establishing some basic cognitive abilities, they're not the main factor when it comes to truly groundbreaking innovation.
Okay, so if not genes, then what?
He suggests that it's human culture itself that's the real engine of genius.
Culture.
Yeah, through this process of cultural evolution, where ideas and practices are shared, refined, and built upon over generations.
So it's like a collective effort building on the work of those who came before.
Exactly. Genius isn't just about individual brilliance, it's also about the cultural context that allows those brilliant ideas to emerge.
So it's not just about the lone genius, it's about the fertile ground that genius can spring from.
That's right. And this connects to his discussion of nature's, well, shameful efficiency.
Shameful, that's an interesting word choice. What does he mean by that?
He's drawing a contrast with, say, a magician.
Okay.
A magician spends a lot of time and energy hiding the work that goes into their illusions.
Right.
But
Yeah.
nature doesn't have to hide anything. It has unlimited time and resources to achieve its goals.
Yeah.
So nature's designs, they might not be elegant or efficient in the way that a human engineer might think,
Right, right.
but they're effective.
They work.
They work. And that's what matters in the long run.
So it's like nature saying, look, I don't care if it's messy as long as it gets the job done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this relates to the concept of adaptationism,
Adaptation is.
which is the idea that a lot of the features we see in organisms, they exist because they solved some problem in the organism's evolutionary past.
Mm.
Now, Dennett, he acknowledges the criticisms that have been made of this idea.
Yeah, like from Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin.
Exactly.
Right.
But he ultimately argues that trying to understand what a biological feature is for, what problem it evolved to solve,
Yeah.
that's still a valuable way to do science.
So even if evolution wasn't, consciously trying to solve a problem,
Right.
the features we see often have an explanation rooted in natural selection.
That's right. It's like, even if evolution takes a roundabout way of getting there, the end result is often something that makes sense from a functional perspective.
Right. Which brings us to teleology, or the idea of purpose in nature. Darwin's theory, it seemed to kind of get rid of the idea of purpose, right? Like evolution was just a blind process.
Yeah.
But Dennett argues that Darwin actually just kind of naturalized it.
Yeah. And he does this by making a really important distinction between two different ways of asking why.
Okay.
So you can ask what for,
Right?
which is about purpose or function.
Like, what is the purpose of a heart?
Exactly. And then you can ask how come,
Okay.
which is about the process, the mechanism
Yeah.
by which something came to be.
Okay, so Darwin gave us the how come,
He did.
right? He explained how evolution happened through this process of natural selection.
Right.
But we can still talk about purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Biologists still talk about the function of an organ,
Yeah.
like the heart is for pumping blood. And Dennett, he argues that this isn't some kind of like pre-Darwinian throwback.
Okay.
It's actually a legitimate way of trying to understand the products of evolution.
So we can talk about purpose in biology, but
Yes.
not as some mystical force. It's more like the purpose emerges from the evolutionary process.
Exactly. It's the functional consequence of all those blind, undirected processes that Darwin described.
So you can ask, look, what is the camouflage of a chameleon for?
Right.
Even though that camouflage evolved through natural selection without any conscious intent, the
Exactly.
purpose emerges from the process.
It does. And this leads to what Dennett calls Darwin's strange inversion of reasoning.
Strange inversion. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's being inverted
Yeah.
exactly?
It's the idea that design,
Right?
the kind of complex, intricate design we see in nature,
Yeah.
that design can come from a process that's fundamentally unintelligent.
So no designer.
No designer.
Yeah.
Just natural selection acting on random variations. Before Darwin, people assumed that design had to come from a designer.
Right, like a watch implies a watchmaker.
Exactly. But Darwin turned that idea on its head.
Okay. I like how Dennett uses the metaphor of lifting in design space to explain this.
Yeah, it's a great way to visualize it. So evolution starts with these simple self-replicators,
Okay.
and then it's like over time it ratchets up the complexity
Bit by bit.
bit by bit
Yeah.
with natural selection favoring those changes that are beneficial.
So the key takeaway is that design doesn't necessarily imply a designer,
That's right.
which is, I think, where the idea of skyhooks comes in.
Yes, skyhooks are these miraculous, unevolvable features that creationists often point to as evidence for intelligent design.
It's like, this is so complex, it couldn't have evolved gradually, so there must have been some divine intervention.
Exactly. But Dennett argues that most of these so-called skyhooks are actually cranes.
Cranes.
Cranes are these step-by-step innovations that, once they're in place, make it possible for evolution to build even more complex things.
Okay, so endosymbiosis was a crane. Right. And then the evolution of sex.
Another crane.
And language.
And culture.
So these are all innovations that make it possible for evolution to create even greater complexity
That's right.
without needing to resort to miracles.
Exactly. The takeaway here is that a lot of things that seem impossible to explain through evolution
Yeah.
actually make sense when you see them as these gradual, step-by-step processes.
Cranes instead of skyhooks. I like that. Okay, so this idea of inverting conventional wisdom,
Right.
it doesn't just apply to Darwin. Dennett also talks about Alan Turing's inversion in the world of computation.
Absolutely. About a century after Darwin,
Okay.
Alan Turing, one of the founders of computer science,
Right.
he comes along and says this.
And I'm quoting here, "In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is."
End quote.
That's kind of mind-blowing. How can a machine be so good at math without actually understanding what math is?
Well, Turing showed that you could have these machines that operate purely on rules for manipulating symbols. They don't need to understand what the symbols represent or what the results mean. They just follow the rules,
Yeah.
and they can perform arithmetic perfectly.
Wow.
This led to his idea of the universal Turing machine.
Right.
This is this theoretical computer that can basically mimic any other computer by just following instructions
Wow.
or software.
Okay.
So what Turing showed was that you could get complex behavior,
Yeah.
behavior that looks intelligent,
Right.
from the execution of these simple, uncomprehending rules.
So just like evolution could produce these incredibly intricate designs without a designer,
Right.
Turing showed that you could get complex computation without genuine understanding in the machine.
Exactly. It's competence without comprehension.
Yeah.
And Turing, he realized that this meant there was a path
A path
from a state of absolute ignorance.
like a blank slate.
Yeah, a blank slate all the way to
At AI.
artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
Through a series of these step-by-step lifting operations in design space. Exactly. And to help us understand this journey from simple life to complex minds, Dennett introduces the concept of ontology.
Ontology.
Yeah, which is basically the set of things that a person or even a system believes to exist.
Like their own personal map of reality.
Right. And then he talks about the manifest image.
Okay. And the manifest image, that's
It's the world as we experience it in our everyday lives,
like the world of trees and chairs and people.
Yeah, all those familiar objects and the colors and the sounds and the feelings.
Yeah, the world of everyday experience.
Exactly. It's the world that we interact with and talk about using our regular language.
And this is contrasted with what he calls the scientific image.
Right. The scientific image is the world, as described by science,
Mhm.
with all the molecules and atoms and forces that we can't directly perceive.
Right.
And Dennett, he makes this interesting observation that even scientists, when they're not doing science, they still live in the manifest image.
Yeah, it's like you can understand the world in terms of quantum mechanics, but you still reach for a coffee cup in the morning.
Right, exactly. So what this tells us is that while science gives us a deeper understanding of reality,
Yeah.
our immediate experience is still rooted in this more intuitive, everyday world of the manifest image.
Okay, so how does this idea of the manifest image connect back to this idea of competence without comprehension?
Well, Dennett, he uses the example of an elevator.
An elevator.
Yeah. So an elevator, it does its job really well, right? It goes up and down, it opens and closes its door.
It responds to button presses.
Exactly. So it has an ontology.
Yeah.
It recognizes floors, doors, passengers,
Yeah.
but it doesn't understand any of it, right? It doesn't know why people are going to different floors. It doesn't understand the engineering that went into its design. All that understanding resides with the people who built it.
So it's competent,
Yes.
but it has no comprehension.
None. And it doesn't need it.
It just works.
It just works. And this is an analogy for how complex systems can exist without any internal understanding of why they're doing what they're doing.
So the elevator is competent without comprehension because it was designed that way by intelligent designers.
Right. But biological systems,
Yeah.
they achieve competence without comprehension through a completely different process.
Evolution. And that leads to the fascinating idea of free-floating rationales.
Right. Free-floating rationales are the reasons why certain designs in nature are advantageous.
Okay.
But those reasons aren't necessarily understood by the organisms that possess those designs.
So, like, our appendix...
Perfect example.
Right. It had a purpose once, but we don't need it anymore.
But our bodies don't know that. They just keep on doing what they evolved to do.
So the rationale for the appendix existing is out there in the evolutionary past. It's not, like, encoded in our bodies somehow.
Exactly. And Dennett, he points out that we can test these free-floating rationales. We can look at what happens when we remove or alter a particular feature and see if it affects the organism's survival or reproduction.
Right.
So even though the organism doesn't understand why a feature exists,
Yeah.
we could still figure out its evolutionary purpose.
So it's like we're reverse engineering evolution to figure out those hidden rationales.
Precisely.
Okay, so Dennett argues that creationists who are looking for, like, commented code in organisms.
Right. Like, God wrote this line to do this.
Yeah, exactly. They're not going to find it. And those who believe in this separate immaterial mind, the Cartesians,
Yeah.
they're not going to find some understanding module in the brain.
Nope. The intelligence isn't in a single conscious agent.
Yeah, it's distributed.
Distributed. He even takes this criticism that was leveled at early AI research,
Which was?
that the intelligence in those systems was really just the programmer's intelligence.
Ah.
And he applies it to biology.
Okay.
He says, look, the apparent intelligence in a tree or a sponge
Yeah.
or an insect,
Yeah.
it's not their intelligence.
It's the intelligence of evolution.
Exactly. Evolution through natural selection is the designer, but it's a blind, uncomprehending designer.
Okay. So we need to shift our perspective
We do.
away from this idea that complex behavior automatically means conscious understanding.
Right. It's a tough one to let go of, but it's essential.
Yeah. And I think the broken wing display in birds is a great example of this.
Oh, yeah. When you see a bird feigning a broken wing to lure a predator away from its nest, it looks incredibly clever, right?
It does. It's like the bird is putting on a show trying to trick the predator.
It's tempting to think that the bird understands what it's doing, that it's consciously planning its actions.
Like it's thinking, okay, if I pretend to be injured, the predator will chase me and my babies will be safe.
Yeah, but Dennett argues that this is probably not what's happening.
So if the bird isn't consciously strategizing,
Right.
then what's going on?
It's most likely an instinctive behavior.
Just instinct.
Just instinct. This behavior, this broken wing display, it's been favored by natural selection because it increases the chances of the chick surviving.
Right.
But the bird itself, it doesn't need to understand why it's doing it.
It just does it.
It just does it.
Hmm.
And there have been experiments with birds like piping plovers
Yeah.
that show that they could even adjust their behavior based on the type of threat.
So like they respond differently to a cow than they do to a fox.
Exactly.
Wow, that's pretty nuanced for just instinct.
It is. But it's still likely based on instincts, not conscious planning.
Right. So even complex behavior, behavior that looks intelligent, can be the result of evolved instincts without any conscious understanding on the part of the animal.
Exactly. And this leads Dennett to propose these different categories of creatures based on their learning abilities.
Okay.
So you have Darwinian creatures,
Darwinian creatures, they're basically.
hardwired.
Okay.
They're running on instinct, on those evolved behaviors that they don't understand.
Okay.
Then you have Skinnerian creatures,
Skinnerian creatures, they're the ones that...
learned through trial and error.
Ah,
Then you have Popperian creatures.
Popperian creatures. Now, they're a bit more sophisticated.
They are. They
Yeah.
look before they leap. They can, like, mentally test out different actions before they actually do them.
Ah, interesting.
And then finally you have Gregorian creatures.
Gregorian creatures, that's us, right?
That's us. We use tools like language and writing.
Right.
And we can control our own mental processes in a way that no other creature can.
We can think about thinking?
We can think about thinking. Dennett believes that this is what sets us apart.
So it's a progression from pure instinct to these increasingly sophisticated forms of learning and problem solving.
That's right.
And even at the top of that progression, with our big human brains, Dennett still talks about this paradox of understanding.
Right. The paradox is that we can often do things like solve problems or learn new skills
Yeah.
without really understanding how we do them.
Right? It's like, I know how to ride a bike, but I can't explain the physics of it.
Exactly. We tend to think of understanding as this conscious grasp of the underlying mechanisms.
Right.
But the work of Freud and modern cognitive science,
Yeah.
it shows us that a lot of our mental processes are unconscious.
Right. We're not always aware of what's going on under the hood.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder, how much do we really understand even our own minds?
Which makes you wonder about the function of consciousness itself, if so much of our competence is unconscious.
It's a great question. Now, Dennett also spends some time talking about information theory, specifically the difference between Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of information
Right.
and semantic information.
Semantic information.
It's the meaning,
Yeah.
the content of information.
Okay.
Shannon's theory, it's all about quantifying information, like how much information is there in a message,
Right.
but it doesn't care about what that information means.
Okay, so it's like measuring the volume of water in a pipe without caring what kind of water it is.
Okay.
Okay, and Dennett uses this term, universal plagiarism, to describe evolution's relationship to semantic information.
Yeah, he says that evolution is basically a master plagiarist.
Plagiarist.
Yeah. It copies anything useful, any good trick it finds.
Like the design of an eye or a wing or...
Exactly. It doesn't care about who came up with the idea first. It just copies it if it works.
But for us humans, plagiarism is a big no-no, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to ideas or inventions or creative works.
Right.
Because for us, creating new information,